Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a prequel of a previous lesson from the 16th chapter of Matthew. We took it from verses 13 all the way till 28, and therein we learn of Peter's correct confession of Yahshua's sonship and divinity. He identifies him correctly as the son of Elohim in response to, "Who do you say that I am?" First thing he does is ask him who the crowd say he is, and they recite the variety of erroneous thoughts out there, Elijah, John the Baptist, one of the prophets, Jeremiah, et al., etc. And then he lays out the demands of discipleship, but we're actually going to begin, the bulk of this prequel is going to consist of what comes before it, and it's a pretty long chapter, chapter 15. We read of three main things, the first of which is a confrontation between the scribes and the Pharisees. In the 16th chapter, it's the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We'll get on them when we get on them. But their question concerns the disciples' lack of observance of their ceremonial traditions, which were unbiblical. These were traditions of men, and the Savior cites Isaiah to hear the apostate echo, and then he lays it on the line. Not that which goes into the mouth defiles the man, but that which comes out of his mouth, that defiles the man. So we're not defiled by the foods we eat or anything we put in our body. We are all more defiled by what comes out, the words we speak, the emanations of our heart. That is the true mark and measure of defilement or purity. And so he quashes that, and he says every plant my Father has not planted will be uprooted. That's a warning to them. And then the other scene takes place in Zor and Zidon. This is in Phoenician territory, which is the neighboring nation to the north. All of his other ministry is primarily located in Galilee, except for the final week, his march into Jerusalem, which I think 21st chapter really begins that. That's when he's welcomed and acclaimed. But here a woman comes to him complaining of a severely demon-possessed daughter, and he says, he recites the popular Jewish prejudice, which categorized Gentiles as dogs. Well, not in Mark's version, I believe. In Mark, she's also a Syro-Phoenician, but Matthew, she's a Canaanite, and says, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." This parallels the instructions that he issued to the 12 in the 10th chapter, "Go not into the fields of Samaria." So the restriction was temporary. Eventually it opened up. But he opens it up right here because the woman gives a sufficiently convincing response of faith that compels him to accommodate her. "Oh, woman, your faith is great. Let it be to you as you will." So she wished it. She wanted. She had the right approach. She had the right attitude, and she was rewarded for her faith. Now, the bulk of the preamble is going to be from verses 30 through 39. This sets much of the context because we're going to read after the sign of Jonah. We're going to read of the leaven of the Pharisees, and it's directly related to the miracle of bread. 30th verse. "And large crowds came to him, having them with those who were lame, blind, dumb, crippled, and many others. And they laid them down at the feet of Yahshua, and he healed them." Entire crowds of people who were helpless, hopeless, they were gathered. They had hope in him, and he was a mass miracle maker who could accommodate every vacancy and deficiency, physical or spiritual or otherwise, whether demon-possessed or physically handicapped. He had the power of healing in his hands. "So the crowds marveled when they saw the dumb speaking, the crippled well, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the Elohim of Israel." So he's able to do everything they want to do. They're only there for one reason. That's to get a new lease on life, to be liberated from the bondage of physical ailment, physical handicap, physical afflictions, which are a prison, which limit what one can and cannot do. And he is master of both matter and spirit. So he's perfectly capable, and they are grateful, and they give the right answer. They praise the Elohim of Israel because he is the Elohim of Israel in their midst. "And Yahshua, having called his disciples near, said, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have now continued with me 3 days, and do not have whatever to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way." So many of his miracles are motivated by compassion and mercy. He has the human human emotion of empathy and compassion. He enters into our pains and he has compassion on us, and there's nothing we can experience that he has not already endured. But he knows that some of these people, it would have been because the power was in his hand, it would have been manifestly unjust for him to send these people away starving after they had clinged on to him for 3 times. The problem is they only have a little bit of food, but the problem solver is in their midst. As soon as he touches it, he is able to feed a crowd, we read, of 4,000. So the disciples, present the question, which, explains the demand and, where are we going to get what we need to get? We lack the resources. They only have 7 loaves of bread and a few little fish, and he commands them on the ground. And taking the 7 loaves and the fish, giving thanks, he broke them and gave to his disciples, and the disciples to the crowd. So the first thing he did was give thanks before the miracle manifested. There was, as far as we know, 7 loaves in his hand when he started, but then he started handing out baskets. But in all attitude, the praises go up, the blessings come down. That's the gravity of gratitude. If you want a miracle, you have to pray for one and never say never, because with all things are possible with him. And all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 7 large basket-fills. So all had more than enough. They had their fill and satisfaction. They were fed. They did not leave empty-stomached or empty-handed. And so the lesson is that we have to conserve our resources, because what they do is they gather, and then we read that there's 4,000 of them. This is distinct from the similar feeding of the 5,000, which occurs in Matthew's 14th chapter. And then he ends the 15th chapter in Magdala. That's the town of Mary of Magdala. And so even though he has a welcome reception or a response of faith in Gentile territory, he is now back in the stifling bigotry of his own country. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came, and trying him, asked him that he would show them a sign from the heaven. Pharisees and Sadducees were 2 otherwise mutually antagonistic sects. They were the preeminent factions in first century Judaism. The Pharisees are the progenitors of the modern Orthodox Jews. The Sadducees went extinct when the temple went extinct. The difference between them were cultural. The Pharisees were kind of conservative, patriotic. The Sadducees were cosmopolitan, culture, and liberal. They were appeasers by nature of the Gentile occupiers. So they occupied the upper rungs of the socioeconomic pecking order. And they were also doctrinally different. The Pharisees, the Sadducees accepted the writings of Moses, the Pentateuch, the Mosaic Law alone as canonical. The Pharisees canonized much of the laws and the prophets. So the Sadducees, they also didn't believe in angels or the resurrection. So they were extremely liberal, even by today's standards. But they have within them the common enemy. So the antagonism between them, the hatred and hostility between themselves, is nothing as compared to the hatred and hostility that reserved to this man who's upsetting the status quo. He is a threat to their power, their influence, their control, their leverage with Rome, and they ultimately conspire with Rome to crucify him as a condemned criminal. And the question they asked him is not with honest intent. They were trying him. That means they were tempting him. They were trying to persuade him and beguile him into making a doubtful utterance of reproach, according to which they could use against him as an offender of their own or Roman law. They were determined to kill them, and they wanted to see a sign from the heavens. Now, the word sign is more than a miracle in the Greek original. I think it translates as paraphrase definition, concrete confirmation that you are divinely endowed. Or you are divinely sent, or something to that effect. But they want to see a sign from the heaven. So, they want evidence that he is who he says he is, that he is the Messiah. And he answering said to them, when it is evening, you say, fair weather, and for the heavens it is red. And in the morning, stormy weather's today, for the heavens is red and overcast. You hypocrites know how to discern the face of the heavens, but not the sign of the times. the ancient Israelites were agriculturalists, and as such, the ability to predict the weather, the movements and machinations of the weather, it's still not an exact science. One need to only tune into the ordinary news channel. They're grossly inaccurate in a lot of their weather predictions, but it would have been useful for ancient agriculturists to be able to predict the signs of the times, the movements of natures, the seasons and flux, in order to reap and sow the most a bountiful harvest. So this is a form of natural revelation. Natural revelation is universal. It is, available to believers and unbelievers alike. In the existence of creation, we have a witness of the Creator. But there's higher levels of spirituality and revelation, and he is the revelation. He is himself. So he's saying that I am a miracle in myself, and there will be no miracle except the sign of Jonah, we eventually read. But the point is, their priorities were all out of whack. They were able to, the stormy weather today, that would have been a day to stay out of there, and the sky being red, I think there's something to do with a portent for rain of some sorts, but I'm not entirely sure. But, I guess fair weather if the heavens were red. A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign shall be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. And he left them and went away. So there's his answer. They wanted a sign, and he said that they're asking for it is evidence and testimony against them, that they are wicked and adulterous. He's not speaking of physical adultery. He's speaking of spiritual adultery. They were estranged from their first love, who was Yahweh, because here was the presence and revelation and manifestation of him in his midst, and they claim to love Yahweh, but they despise his son. So you cannot claim to love someone and despise their very own heaven-sent son. And the sign of Jonah, they have no way of knowing what that means. They would have looked at him in bewilderness. He has a way of getting the last word without and leaving his detractors in confusion and doubt and darkness. So the sign of the Jonah is the Old Testament prophet of the minor prophets in the of the books classified as the minor prophets in the Old Testament. Jonah is distinct in that it follows a narrative, whereas the rest are more or less prophetic proclamations. Jonah, we find him, he's resistant and recalcitrant and rebellious and stubbornly so to the calling. He's called to cry out against Nineveh, whose sins had screamed to the heavens, and Jonah resisted, and he doesn't want to do that. He didn't want to be a fire and brimstone preacher in Nineveh. There was no glamour in that, so he gets on a boat in Joppa and tries to head to Tarshish, which was the end of the known world. That would be been beyond the Rock of Gibraltar, the western extremity of the Mediterranean. So he tries to go that way, but before he can get there, the storm collides him, and then he voluntarily volunteers himself to be tossed over the sign when he realizes that it is for his sake that this storm has been sent. And the storm immediately calms when they cast him over, and Jonah is sent into the belly of a fish rather, in the Old Testament. It's whale in the New Testament, but it's fish in the Hebrew original, and there he spends 3 days before he is vomited out. He gives his best prayer in his worst location. The second chapter of Jonah is a beautiful, eloquent, moving psalm influenced prayer. But much as the Jonah spent 3 days in the belly, so too would the Son of Man spend 3 days in the grave and then rise on the third. And a greater than Jonah was he. We can also read of this in the 12th chapter, the more extensive elaboration on the sign of Jonah. And his disciples came to the other side and had forgotten to take bread. So this would have been a cause for controversy because there are critics never there. So this is the same scene. This is the other side, maybe the other side of the vicinity, or maybe the other side of the lake. But in any case, wherever they were, they had forgotten to take bread. And this would have been a big no-no according to the sticklers for the ceremonial, unbiblical traditions. And Yahshua said to them, "Mind and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." So the leaven is likened to sin in his analogy. They don't immediately intuit it, but he does eventually explain there's cause for confusion because they interpret what he says far too literally. And so he wants them to pay attention to the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The leaven, he is the bread of life. This is implied by his most recent sermon. But the leaven is the sin, which spreads quickly and is contagious. And once you let their influence seep into your mind, then you become the blind leading the blind. So stay away. Now, the specific leaven of the Pharisees was their militantly meticulous observance of extra requirements of their own making. They took it upon themselves to add to the law of Moses so people could look up to them and exalt themselves on a pedestal. They loved money. They were motivated by money, even though they were fastidious in dress and appearance. They weren't flashy, but they did covet money, unlike the Sadducees, who would have been the aristocratic. They would have worn fancier robes. The Sadducees was one of unbelief. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They didn't believe in the angels, even though both that much is inferred from the Pentateuch, as the Master makes known in his, I think it's in the 19th chapter of Matthew's account, when he he confronts the Pharisees with their question of a woman who had 7 brothers and whose wife will for husband and whose wife will she be in the resurrection, and he chides them for neglecting to formulate from Exodus 6:3 the resurrection, because he identifies himself as the Elohim of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, with the implicit that he is the Elohim of the living. So by 2 and 2, that means that the patriarchs are still living in his presence, resurrected. And they reasoned among themselves, saying, because we bought no bread. So they are missing the meaning and missing the point. Their eyes are chained to the earth. He's talking about one thing. He's talking about spiritual things, and they're talking about physical things. Their mind is still on the miracle, the feeding of the 4,000, of which we most recently read. We reviewed it. We didn't exactly read it. But Joshua, aware of this, said to them, O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves, because you brought no bread? He chides his disciples accordingly. They are missing the meaning. Their eyes are on the earth. They're thinking about bread and leaven and literal leaven and physical leaven. He's calling them to unlock the greater spiritual truth, which is subterranean and above and beyond itself. But the point is that their faith and the fact that they are walking by the eyes of sight and not of faith is testament and witness against them that they are not using the eyes of faith, ergo they are faithless, and they have little belief. And so he's going to explain, 9th verse, do you still not understand, neither remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you picked up? This takes us to the 14th chapter of Matthew. This is the even greater feeding, numerically measured. In the one we reviewed, it was 4,000. In the 14th chapter, he feeds the 5,000, and then he walks on the water all a day and a night in the same day of the most remarkable man who ever lived on the earth. And, many people were there because they were hungry, and they did not hunger after or thirst after the kingdom of Elohim and his righteousness, which satisfies spiritually. So a lot of people who had benefited from the miracle missed the meaning. He could offer them more bread, which would not outlast the event or occasion. He could offer them something that was everlasting, the bread of life. And he's perplexed to see the same ignorance circulating amongst his inner entourage, his closest disciples, the one who walked with him, lived with him, learned from him, ministered in mutual proximity. Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000, and how many large baskets you picked up. This takes us to the 15th chapter, the one we reviewed. There were 7 loaves to begin with, and then that was sufficient for him to feed 4,000. He multiplied enough of them to feed. Everyone was satisfied, as we already covered. No one left away hungry. No one went away empty stomach. No one went away unfulfilled or empty. But how is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? So their eyes are chained to the earth, and as such, they miss the heavenly spiritual principle. They're thinking about one thing, and he asked them, "Did you really intuit the spiritual meaning of the miracle, which was to give something that was to be spiritually everlasting and satisfactory?" But 4,000. But, he's talking about the Pharisee, which is the doctrine. The doctrine has a contagious effect, which spreads like the plague, whether the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There's really no lesser of two evils between them because they are both equally evil and aligned and determined. There were some good Pharisees that we read of, Joseph of Arimathea and also Nicodemus were secret. So the Pharisees were not exactly unanimous in the Sanhedrin consenting to his execution, but the Sadducees might have been. They had the most to lose. The high priest at the time, the Sadducee, Caiaphas, in John's 11th chapter, he marks him to die for the sake of the nation. So this wasn't quite in effect just yet. That was close to the Passover. We're a little before that. Then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of the bread, but the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So it finally registered with them. It had to take a while to sit and saturate and get in their mind, but his explanation alleviates the former ignorance, doubt, and confusion and lack of awareness or understanding. He's saying, the teaching is the Pharisees. So it's not the leaven. They're thinking leaven, what possible leaven could come? What is different about the leaven of the Pharisees or the Sadducees from everyone else? Leaven is leaven, but they have distinct doctrines, each of which are equally dangerous in their extremism and lead nowhere good. They lead straight to a ditch. They are blind leading the ditch. So we who are children of the light, we must walk by the light. The light is our guide, our compass, our path. And that's the reason we're here, and that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.